just hardware devices that ran games, things like internal storage, and as well as the sort of early interactions with the internet and online connectivity started here. This is sort of the Goldilocks generation for hacking, where it's not too complicated, but it's also complicated enough to be interesting. So I'll mainly be talking about these consoles today. On to the modern era. They're a lot more focused on online connectivity now, and they've actually started to remove features like the optical drive, which is odd, since it was such a big addition. I won't be talking too much about these, but I'll address them at the end. So on to the history of hacking now, or console hacking. So when did the sort of first video game hack actually start? Well, a lot of people say it was during the sort of 50s when a PhD student decided to modify this humongous room-sized calculator, and what he did was get it to run XYZs, or noughts of crosses, tic-tac-toe. But I don't think we can call this large device a video game console, so I don't really know if it counts as video game console hacking. We take a big jump 30 years to the 80s, whenever I think a lot of people had their first exposure to video games through arcade machines. And I think sort of the sort of hacking might have started here if you managed to acquire your own arcade machine and you maybe didn't want to have to insert coins all the time. So you would maybe modify it in some way so it didn't require them. I think as well, the sort of home consoles started coming in at this period, with sort of the first and second generations in the 80s. So the kind of first home hacking was done through these things like cheating devices, is sort of their general name. Here we have the action replay, and what this allowed you to do was not only pause your game, but also save it, which was considered cheating back then. Commonplace features nowadays in sort of single-player games as well. And these cheating devices went on for ages. I remember seeing in shops action replay just on sale in like the high street, which is really weird to see that this sort of device. Now, as sort of a cybersecurity person, it would just be strange to walk into Asda and you see like a Flipper Zero. It would just be weird to see like a product being commercially sold like that. On into the 90s, this is when piracy became sort of a big concern, with a lot of copies of the games starting to appear. This is one of the first examples of a device that you could use to copy games. This is for the Atari, where to copy a new game, you needed to reprogram an entire microprocessor, and then you had a weird device that you kind of like plug and played the different microprocessors. Not only were people sort of stealing or pirating the games, people started inventing their own unlicensed games, which are commonly known as like bootlegs, which was just, you know, copyright infringement, and the games industry didn't like this either. So what did the games industry learn at this stage? Well, they realized, okay, we should maybe protect the data on our sort of systems. So they created digital rights management, or sort of DRM, or basically like defense against people trying to hack their consoles. So moving on to the popularization of sort of console hacking. And as I mentioned earlier, this was all down to the optical drive. It aided in game development a lot, but it also presented a really easy way for people at home to make their own copies. DVD burners were a really like common product that a lot of people had in their homes, and you could just take a disc and make a copy of it. So how did video games stop you from doing this? So the first one I'm going to talk about is the PlayStation. So the actual data on the disc itself, they put absolutely no protection, no obfuscation or anything on it. Instead, they implemented what is known as the wobble groove. So at the very inside of the disk, which is the first portion to be read, they put this weird wobbly pattern that couldn't be easily replicated by those home burners. And at the start of the reading of the disk, it would check, is this weird groove here? If so, it's a legitimate disk. Now load the data. So how did hackers get around this? Well, you didn't actually really need to do any hacking. You just needed to be quick. So as I said, the check happens before the rest of the disk is read. So if you had a legitimate disk with a legitimate wobble groove, let it read that for a couple seconds, and then just quickly open the PlayStation, take one disk out, put the other one in. If you're fast enough, it just reads the second disk and thinks it's already authenticated, so it'll go ahead and run whatever's on it. So it was defeated relatively easily. So what did the games industry learn from this? Well, we should probably put protection on the whole disk, not just at the start of the reading sequence. So staying with PlayStation, the PlayStation 2 then came out. So how did they protect the disk this time? Well, they scattered different parts of a product code throughout the disk. And then they also put an unburnable watermark logo at the start. Think of this as like a even better wobble groove. And these were sort of two halves of an encryption system on the disk itself. So at this stage, I'm going to say that the disk security cannot be reasonably broken, and this will be for all the systems going forward. So the disks themselves are sort of secure. So how do we get around this? Well, we're going to target the thing that reads the disk. In the case of the PlayStation 2, this is the Mechacon, short for mechanical controller. And how was this done? So the Mechacon, when it's loading up the disk, it checks the format of the disk, and it looks for DVD-ROM, which is read-only memory. So this format of disk means that you can only read from it and not write on it. So whatever was put in there in like the factory, they know that that's the only thing on the disk. So if you made a copy or changed this disk anyway, it would turn to like a DVD-R format, which wouldn't be allowed by the Mechacon. So to get around this, the first, or sort of one of the most popular mod chips was created, known as the Messiah chip, which was actually, it required like 20 wires to be done. The reason being, you would maybe think the simple way to get rid of this is to just not do this check, but it had to be done. So what the Messiah chip did was add this DVD-R format to the allowed formats. So it would allow either DVD-ROM or DVD-R formats. So what did the games industry learn from this? Well, we should probably also check the integrity of like the components and the firmware on the components, and that they've not been like modified by a chip like this. Moving on, we're going into what I deemed the Goldilocks generation earlier, and we're going to swap to PlayStation's long-term rival, the Xbox, with arguably their best console, arguably their only good console. So we're saying again, the disk security can't be broken. So how did they go about securing the firmware of their sort of different components? So they encrypted them with unique per device keys, and this key would get checked by a hypervisor before they would be allowed to interact in any way. So if you tampered with the disk driver, the hypervisor would go, whoa, this thing is not signed with the correct key, so we're not going to run it. So to write your own firmware onto this, it was actually relatively easy to get the key and then just sign your own code with that key. And because they were sort of separate locations, you could just sniff the key as it traveled along. And then you could sort of sign your own custom firmware and then write it onto the disk drive flash memory via the SPI interface. And this was really easily done because the flash memory was just completely unprotected. So it was easily defeated. So what did the games industry learn from this? We should probably disable the write privileges on our firmware storage. Now, I'm not actually going to move on to another console technically, because Xbox had an opportunity to try again. If you remember the Red Ring of Death, as I said, arguably the best console they ever made. That's if you had one that worked. So we come to the 360 Slim to try again, and what Xbox said was, see this flash memory? What we're going to do is actually just put it inside of the controller. Good luck getting to it now. So they've stacked the two chips on top of each other. So here's a picture of the two chips with the cap removed, and as you can see, the other one's on top, and the sort of wires are all on top of each other. And this SPI interface was then tied high, so it was permanently deactivated. So the only way that we would be able to reasonably write in the same way is we would have to somehow cut the wire, but this is inside of a chip with a cap on it. So it's not as simple as just snipping something. As you can sort of see already from this diagram, there's kind of some lines. And what they're actually doing is sort of giving you a way to line up where this wire is, because it was on the same point on every chip. And then you would apply the kamikaze hack, where you would take a drill to your chip and go in. Now, you don't want to go straight through. This is why it's called the kamikaze hack. As you can see in the picture on the very far side, there's actually two wires on top of each other. So if you drill too far and cut the bottom wire, the entire Xbox is broken. So you need to go far enough, but not too far, which is why it got named the kamikaze hack. So what did the games industry learn from this? Well, we should probably also protect the keys, because if we couldn't easily sniff them, then doing this would be pointless if they didn't have a key to sign the software. We're going to move on to the Wii, and their disk drive security, or their sort of chip. Well, they actually used the same disk drive or disk reader as the GameCube, which was a really stupid idea, because it had been out for years and there was tons of exploits and mod chips already existing for this. So it was essentially beatable on day one. But because that makes a really boring talk, we're going to now up the stakes and say, right, instead of just running our own disks, what if we wanted to actually run our own software on this console? As I mentioned earlier, at this stage, they started being a lot more like computers. So what if we wanted to do something with that compute power? This is sort of known in the community as homebrew, sort of writing your own software onto consoles. So looking at the Wii's security, so they kept the operating system memory really, really safe, and they stored all the keys within that. So once they were written in the factory, they would never be accessible ever again. The way they did this was they had this memory handler chip that basically was like, nothing outside will ever get access to this memory other than the Wii sort of operating system itself. And they encrypted everything with all their different firmware things with these keys. But because they're already in the operating system, you can't get them easily. As I mentioned earlier, they used the same reader as the GameCube. And this was actually because the Wii was backwards compatible with the GameCube, and it had a mode it would go into to run these GameCube games. They were smart enough to realize that any of the exploits you would run in GameCube mode would still exist in this new version. They didn't go back and fix any of them. So what they did was make sure that when it went into GameCube mode, the memory that it was allocated wouldn't be anything that was sort of important or where the keys were. So yes, any of the exploits that you can use in GameCube mode can't leave GameCube mode. So we've got a diagram here of the Wii memory. It looks exactly like this. Within this we have our key, and it's safely stored inside there. So when we go into GameCube mode, you can see that we can't get to the key because it's sort of locked to only this quarter of the memory. But what if we moved the GameCube memory in some way? We would then be able to use an exploit to read the keys. And this was done by Team Tweezers with the word "we" in it, which is great. And they realized if you take a pair of tweezers, you can basically short circuit the board in a way that you move what memory is readable in GameCube mode, and then you can just go and read the key. So now we have the key. How do we write onto the "we"? So Team Tweezers came back for back-to-back victories here, and they created the Twilight hack, where they used Zelda Twilight Princess to enable you to run homebrew from an SD card. And the way this worked was you gave your horse, normally called Epona, a really long name, and it caused a buffer overflow. So you push the memory address to read from the SD card. So what did the games industry learn here? We should probably assess the security of legacy modes before we implement them into our systems. Returning back to the PlayStation 3 to finish the talk with some more Sony. At the time when it launched, they touted it was the most computer of any video game console yet, and this was unique to a Cell processor that it was dubbed. Ironically, this has turned out to be like a really bad decision because it's really difficult to develop on this processor type, and getting this to run nowadays is still really difficult to emulate PS3. And any of the PS3 games, you'll have seen that they haven't had a quick, easy cash grab remaster in Super HD, because even Sony themselves can't figure out how to get this old architecture working on their current consoles. At the time, they sold the hardware for a really good price, because they thought they'd make the money back on the games, and this ended up seeming like a really good compute deal. So they had some ridiculous news stories like this supercomputer cluster made out of like 2,000 PlayStations being built. And this was actually a really bad idea from like Sony's marketing, because then they lost a whole lot of money because people weren't buying games, they were just using it as a computer instead. So that's one factor. Another thing is basically one guy online in like a forum theoretically, he didn't actually do it, he just theoretically was like, this is how I defeat the security, and it would definitely work. And it was like shortly after this, the feature was removed. So people think this one guy might have done it. It was either that or the fact that it was losing them tons of money. Either way, removing this feature did cost them a lot in lawsuits, but it took 4 years until the PlayStation 3 was actually then fully hacked, which is a really long time. Most of the other consoles, even nowadays, today, it's like a couple of weeks, maybe a couple of months before they're defeated. But how was this done? It was done through the PS jailbreak, which was a device that was like sold for £100 at the time, and there's sort of a honor among hackers, where if one person figures it out, they sort of explain how it was done so people can replicate it. And this other company was like, no, we're not going to tell you, give us £100 and then we'll let you do it. So this caused an infighting basically among them, and a whole load of other hackers then hacked the hacking device to reverse engineer how you can do it yourself for cheap. And you could do it sort of at the time if you had like an Arduino or Raspberry Pis were just starting to appear in about 2010 when this was done. So how did it work? Well, this USB device would act as like a USB hub, and it would muck around with things like a heap overflow exploit, which is to do with memory, and it would also at some stage fake credentials as the debug jig, and basically all you had to do was name yourself the correct name and it would believe you were a legitimate debug jig, which is what Sony used for testing their consoles. So what did the games industry learn from this? Well, we should probably make the debug mode harder to access. You should also not have memory exploits, but that I think goes without saying. As this is our last one, I'm going to go a bit more in depth. I know the talk is nearly over, you're probably half asleep, but if you can stay with me, it's like 8 steps, but I'll try and walk you through it in a way you understand. So we have 2 different USB hubs. This is like 2 views of the same thing. So the top one is what the PlayStation thinks it sees, and the bottom one is what is actually going on within the sort of USB hub. So step 1, we're going to insert the payload, the sort of final thing which runs, and what this payload did was basically reallocate the memory address of the disk reader to an external hard drive where you would store all of your pirated games, and it would run from that external source. But how do we run this payload? So we're now going to insert something into the second slot. Doesn't actually matter what this is, you'll see later. And we're then going to insert a heap exploit into the third one, and this takes up so much memory that it actually fills 3 and 4, but the PlayStation thinks number 3 is just filled. We're then going to remove the second port, the device in the second port. The reason we're doing this is if it tries to put something into a memory address which is full, it will put it into the first available one instead. So we're then going to insert the shell code, which the debug jig is able to run into 4, but 4 is actually already full. So this moves down to 2, but the PlayStation doesn't think it's there. It thinks it's in 4. We're then going to insert at the same time another heap exploit, but also assign number 5 as the jig. But because 5 and 6 are actually full, the jig is going to point to 2, which it thinks is empty. So this will actually then execute the shell code in the jig, which will run the payload on the first USB. So that's how it works. So just some closing thoughts. What about the modern era? It's become more of a software challenge than a hardware challenge. Like I talked a lot about the hardware stuff today. The online connectivity for a lot of games requires constant updates. So even if you find an exploit and a hack, probably the next week it's removed. And what about hacking old consoles? Does it still happen? It does, but there's emulation is kind of used if you're wanting to mod games or things a lot of the time. It's just easier now that we have the compute power to run our own consoles inside a computer. Some takeaways. PlayStation 1, protect your entire piece of media. PlayStation 2, check the integrity of your firmware. Xbox 360, protect your keys, make them drill proof. The Wii, assess security of any legacy modes before you implement them. The PlayStation 3, make your debug mode harder to access. I think the last 2 are probably the most important pieces of information. This advice is all really, really out of date. And most importantly though, gamers or hackers as well will find a way into your devices. Yeah, so if you want to get in touch, there's a QR code, and please check out some of these. They do great videos, which I took a lot of inspiration from YouTubers listed over here. But I think I have time for maybe a question or 2.
Matthew, thank you very much. Really enjoyed what you had to share. We do have time for a couple of questions. Are there any questions in the room?
It's because I already took the easy one.
There we go. If not,